Hello everyone, it's Devin. Welcome back to the channel, and welcome to the first installment of a new series I will be doing here called Ranked, where I will take an artist's entire discography and I will rank all of their albums from my least favorite to my mostest favorite. And for this first installment, I've chosen to tackle a pretty big one. In this video, I will be ranking the discography of singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, producer, actor, pop culture icon, chameleonic, rock visionary, David Bowie. One of the single greatest and most influential figures in rock history, responsible for countless classic albums. Across his decades-long discography, Bowie's music has run the gamut of glam rock, pop rock, art rock, experimental electronic and ambient music, dance pop, industrial, and much more. He's known for his unique, boundary-breaking style and iconic characters like Major Tom and Ziggy Stardust and the Thin White Duke. And counting his work with the short-lived Tin Machine project, he has 28 albums, and I'm gonna talk about all of them. Got the Bowie shirt on, I'm ready to go, so without further ado, let's start at number 28. My least favorite David Bowie LP is easily his 1987 effort, Never Let Me Down. The 80s were a hard time to be a 70s rock star. All the good bands were becoming bad and the bad bands were becoming worse. And while David Bowie fared better than most in the first few years of the 80s, it didn't take long for him to succumb to the trends of the time and start to release some of the worst music of his career. For an artist whose appeal is so often defined by the characters he plays in his music, Never Let Me Down is shockingly joyless and devoid of any distinct identity, despite being somewhat eccentric. The album consists of 11 overblown, overproduced 80s pop songs that just go on for way too long. The song Beat of Your Drum is terribly repetitive, the song Glass Spider begins with a cornball spoken word intro, and the song Shining Star is maybe one of my least favorite David Bowie tracks, period. The awkward, herky-jerky rhythm on that track is just awful. There are some more redeemable songs throughout the track listing, like the title track or the song Day In, Day Out, but even those songs have their flaws, like the woo-hoo vocalizations on Day In, Day Out still visit me in my nightmares. Overall, Never Let Me Down stands as a real low point in Bowie's career, and serves as a moment where it seemed like he had almost totally lost his creative spark and subversive edge.
Don't be afraid of the man in the moon, because it's only me.
Before he could lose his edge, though, he needed to find it, and listening back to David Bowie's quaint 1967 Tony Visconti-produced debut album, he was in desperate need of something. While Never Let Me Down is a decidedly unfun listen, there's actually quite a bit of fun to be had listening to the self-titled record in just how far removed it is from what we know as David Bowie from a personality standpoint, because the overly quirky, tongue-in-cheek pop rock on this album is much more adjacent to something like, I don't know, like a collection of the worst Paul McCartney story songs imaginable more than anything David Bowie. We have songs here that are so overly sweet and kitschy that it's kind of painful, like Love You Till Tuesday and Rubber Band, as well as some surprising, questionable attempts at social commentary, like the ham-fisted and generally terrible We Are Hungry Men. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the puzzling, sort of spoken word closer on here, the track Please Mr. Gravedigger, which is definitely one of the most confusing tracks here. It's not all bad though. Buy Me a Coat is a decent song. And on another one of the better songs here, the track She's Got Medals, Bowie presents listeners with a story of a woman who sneaks into and out of the military dressed as a man, which almost kind of foreshadows the outrageous cross-dressing characters that Bowie would assume in later years. So there's that. We have have Tin Machine 2. Now, for those of you who don't know, Bowie's Tin Machine period from 1988 to 1992 was the only time in his career where he recorded as part of a band rather than as a solo artist. The band, named Tin Machine, consisted of Bowie on lead vocals, Reeves Gabrels on lead guitar, and Hunt and Tony Sales playing drums and bass respectively. Tin Machine as a concept was Bowie attempting to distance himself as much as possible from his poppy late 80s output, which he expressed personal disdain for by recording some garage rock and kind of getting back to basics. And while I do have a soft spot for the group's first record, I can't say I care for Tin Machine 2 that much, obviously because it is placing so low on the list. Don't have much to say about this one other than that it is some of the most uninspired and boring rock music that Bowie ever put his name to. It's an extremely safe, kind of mild exercise in garage rock that lacked the in-the-moment energy and just kind of general Bowie weirdness that we found a little bit of in Tin Machine 1. Also, the track Stateside is like a really bad song. Yeah, I don't care much for this album. Next. Bowie's 1984 LP, Tonight. While not quite as bad as Never Let Me Down, it was the first album where Bowie really started to kind of disappear down the commercial rabbit hole. Tonight was a somewhat artsy, though thoroughly boring 80s pop record featuring some of Bowie's most meandering material ever, like the song Don't Look Down, as well as some of his just worst all-around songs, like the title track here really wastes its guest appearance from Tina Turner, and the version of God Only Knows by the Beach Boys that Bowie assembles here stands as easily his worst cover and one of the worst songs to appear on any of his albums. Even with all that said though, the highlights on Tonight actually aren't too bad and they kind of bring the album up a little bit. Songs like Loving the Alien and Neighborhood Threat are pretty solid. But overall, Tonight is a deeply flawed album loaded with boring commercial tracks and gimmicky effects that just haven't aged well, as well as some generally weak writing and performances. 1999's Hours, easily one of the least essential and most mild offerings that Bowie ever made. And you may notice I keep saying the word mild, and that's because a pretty common theme throughout a lot of Bowie's worst works isn't that they're outright terrible, but more that they're just kind of, very oddly safe. They lack the creative edge and risk factor that his best stuff had. And there is perhaps not another Bowie album as just mild and meandering as Hours. Again, not a bad listen. It does sound nice while it's on in the background, but it doesn't leave much of a strong impression at all. The tunes are extremely average, the instrumental palette is pretty bland, and the lyrics are really subpar and just not nearly as evocative as what you would expect from David Bowie. There are some highlights like the tracks Survive and Thursday's Child, which I do like, but overall I can't really recommend Hours. Bowie's 1993 LP, Black Tie, White Noise, stands as one of his most interesting misfires. This was his first post-Tin Machine solo LP, and it showed Bowie kind of returning to some of the funk and plastic soul elements that he explored on his 1975 album Young Americans, but with a bit more of an eccentric edge about it and a stronger emphasis on sampling and electronics. The production throughout Black Tie, White Noise consists of snappy disco drums, funky bass lines, guitar scratches, and some very lavish atmospheric effects. But the way these elements kind of come together, although they are delivered in a kind of odd and again eccentric manner, they just kind of result in some blocky, bland funk grooves. Bowie's vocal performances are consistently uninteresting here, and the songs in general just aren't very good. A lot of them are very awkward in execution. Out of the lackluster Bowie albums, Black Tie, White Noise is definitely one of the most interesting ones, because it does have quite a bit of personality going on, and I do think there was potential in that personality, but ultimately, with the songwriting and the odd production choices, I do think Black Tie, White Noise kind of panned out as another awkward misfire for Bowie. Finally, getting into the albums I actually like. enjoy. Pinups is an album consisting almost entirely of cover songs released by Bowie in 1973. It is the second album that Bowie released that year, following the incredible Aladdin Sane, which I will get to. Pinups is little more than a footnote in Bowie's discography, and it's often kind of forgotten and left to the wayside, as it is a pretty low-stakes effort and isn't nearly as instrumentally or compositionally ambitious as most of the music Bowie was making at the time. But to be fair, it was never really meant to be anything more than that. The covers themselves are fairly simple, and the instrumental palette is rudimentary with its glam rock guitars and showy pianos, but it's still pretty decent actually. It's not an essential piece of Bowie's canon or anything, but it is interesting to hear his take on songs from Pink Floyd and The Who and The Kinks for fans who are interested. Pinups is a snapshot of an artist in his prime, kind of paying homage to those who inspired him, and for what it is, it's not that bad. In a way, it's kind of Bowie's Teal album. First Tin Machine record is an album I've always seen as kind of one of the more underappreciated records in Bowie's discography. It's far from the most groundbreaking or even essential rock records that Bowie ever made, but I do think that the return to the basics of freewheeling garage rock is something that is immensely important to Bowie's artistic trajectory at the time. Like I said earlier, the Tin Machine era was Bowie trying to distance himself from the sickeningly commercial, poppy music that he was making in the late 80s. At its core, Tin Machine is a ballsy, energetic rock record that contains more than a few bangers. Some of my favorites include the punky Bus Stop, the frenzied Under the God, and the actually pretty incredible opening track to this record, the song Heaven's in Here, which features an absolutely, face-melting outro guitar solo from Reeves Gabrels. I do think Reeves was actually a pretty excellent guitar foil for Bowie. Throughout his career, Bowie kind of took on many different guitar foils, like Mick Ronson in the 70s, and I do think that Reeves Gabrels is one of the more underappreciated figures in that sense, because, man, his playing on this record is pretty tight. Some of the lyrics are a little questionable and are kind of bad at times, but I do think that Tin Machine still stands as a super entertaining rock record with great performances, great production, and way more hits than misses.
Hey, make some man, take things over. Hey.
Young Americans, one of Bowie's most commercially successful and beloved albums, and one I've never really loved as much as most people. Young Americans saw Bowie completely foregoing the glam rock stylings of his earlier 70s work in favor of a bouncy blend of pop and soul music, and a little bit of funk dubbed Plastic Soul for its rigid, snappy production. This sound brought forth two of the biggest hits of Bowie's career, the song Fame and the title track on here. Now, these two songs are absolutely fantastic, classic pieces of 70s pop that still sound great today, but unfortunately I do think they kind of overshadow a lot of the other material on here. A lot of the other songs just aren't nearly as well written or as catchy. Few of them can compare to that immortal hook of all night. These songs, Win and Right, are fairly pretty pop songs, but at the album's worst you get these overproduced pieces of gentrified soul music like Across the Universe. Still though, it is a pretty decent entry in Bowie's discography with some incredible highlights, and it is certainly worth a listen, if only to hear those great singles. All night! Often labeled as a soundtrack, Buddha of Suburbia is a companion album to the obscure British television miniseries of the same name. Like Pinups, and probably more than Pinups, this is another album that is often lost through the cracks and forgotten in the grander scheme of Bowie's discography, which is a shame because I think it's quite good. On Buddha of Suburbia, Bowie assembled elements of krautrock, jazz, and ambient music to create a very interesting, if somewhat haphazard listening experience. This interesting synthesis of influences led to several moments of underrated genius, like the abstract jazz of South Horizon and the ambient majesty of The Mysteries, as well as the song Dead Against It, which is a pretty fantastic electronically influenced rock song. You also have the song Strangers When We Meet, beautiful ballad, and the track Bleed Like a Craze, Dad. Not one of my faves on here, but I do appreciate how the bold, loud rock instrumentation on this song kind of foreshadowed Bowie's embrace of industrial rock later in the 90s. More on that later. So yeah, Buddha of Suburbia definitely has some very underappreciated highlights, but it's not perfect. There are some lackluster moments, like a lot of the ambient tracks are kind of uneventful and boring. They're not all as good as The Mysteries. And the krautrock dirge, Sex and the Church, is pretty terrible. The beat is boring, the vocal effects are annoying, and the lyrics are like insanely repetitive, not to mention it goes on for 6 minutes. Still though, I do think Buddha of Suburbia is a project that deserves a little more attention, cause while it's not perfect, I think there's a lot to love here.
This is ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade.
Released in 1969, Bowie's second studio album is another self-titled effort that is often referred to as Space Oddity due to the resounding success of that single. While this is not one of my absolute favorite Bowie records, it does mark a very important moment in his discography as his first major leap as a songwriter. This album was a huge step up from his Milquetoast debut album. On that album, Bowie was like a bumbling dork, but on this album, Bowie is dramatic and ambitious. The instrumental palette is a grand mixture of acoustic guitars and strings, and Bowie's songwriting on here is considerably better than on his debut. Some highlights here include the epic 9-minute Signet Committee, which showed Bowie critiquing the militant side of the hippie movement, as well as the cutting acoustic number God Knows I'm Good, and of course the endlessly iconic Space Oddity single, which was really Bowie's big breakthrough into the mainstream and actually led some people to declare him a one-hit wonder at the time. Bowie still definitely had a lot of room to grow as an artist with the release of this album, as I do think there are some spots where the vocals are a little rough and some of the longer, more ambitious cuts on here can kind of drag, but still, I think this is a very solid, very good project that was kind of a sign of better things to come in the 70s.
Like you. Wow!
Bowie's 2003 LP, Reality, was, at the time of its release, supposed to be Bowie's final album, his kind of swan song. Now, in retrospect, we know Bowie would go on to release 2 more albums, but in context, I do think Reality is what would have been a fitting send-off for Bowie. On this album, Bowie kind of harkens back to some of his zanier fusions of art rock and pop. It's a very pristine, withdrawn album with some really great highlights like the song New Killer Star or the demented disco of Pablo Picasso. I also just have to mention the 7-minute ballroom trip of Bring Me the Disco King, which really finishes off Reality on a high note. There isn't a ton to say about the Anime Boy album other than that it is a very solid and classy piece of art rock. Bowie's 1983 LP, Let's Dance, is one of his most popular albums, and it's an album that helped to solidify his superstardom in the 80s. In terms of sound, Let's Dance isn't too unlike the twin commercial duds of Tonight and Never Let Me Down. Compared to those albums, Let's Dance is less eccentric, more accessible, and it's actually good. And this is simply because the songs and the writing here is just so much better than on those albums. Let's Dance was boosted by a trio of fantastic killer singles like the title track, the song Modern Love, and the song China Girl, which was a cover of an Iggy Pop song that Bowie and Iggy Pop actually co-wrote back in the 70s. Now we have Bowie's version here. Modern Love is easily my favorite. It's actually one of my favorite Bowie songs of all time. The groove on that track is just so stellar. And the way the song just builds and rides out that last chorus for like the last 2 minutes of the songs and just keeps creeping up that scale is awesome. Vocally, Bowie brings a lot of swagger here while still maintaining some of his wilder vocal inflections. The production greatly benefits from Bowie working in close quarters with Nile Rodgers of Chic for much of this album. Nile's presence and influence is a big part of why Let's Dance sounds as infectious, instantaneous, and as fun as it does. Bowie once said of the collaboration that Nile is the only person who has ever gotten him to start a song with the chorus. My biggest criticism is that the album is kind of front-heavy in terms of the writing quality, but I mean, it's only 9 tracks and less than 40 minutes, and it manages to be thoroughly entertaining throughout.
Stars are never sleeping.
I mentioned before that upon its release, Reality was intended to be Bowie's final studio album, so fans and critics were surprised when Bowie returned 10 years later with an entirely new studio album in The Next Day. On The Next Day, Bowie kind of revisits some of the jazzy art rock of his late 70s output, which is nice because that's my favorite Bowie era. Obviously, the album's artwork is a slight reworking of the photograph from Bowie's 1977 album Heroes. This interesting choice of artwork kind of emphasizes the link between this album and that period of Bowie's career. This album is far from a rehash, though, as on The Next Day, Bowie is able to explore some very mature, dark, and intriguing lyrical themes given just how much older he was at the time of recording this album compared to the albums that inspired it. Really, it was just kind of Bowie returning to his old stomping grounds and just doing himself justice. The writing throughout this album is pretty consistent. Songs like The Stars Are Out Tonight are fantastic. Bowie sounds totally in his element here and proved that he had still got it even this late in his career.
We could run when the rain slows.
Heathen, Bowie's 2002 LP, stands as one of the most desolate and eerie albums in his entire discography. Much of Heathen is a barren, synthetic wasteland that is kind of depressing, but it's undeniably beautiful at the same time. Heathen is also one of Bowie's most cover-heavy studio albums, aside from Pinups, of course, as it includes several different covers, including, but not limited to, a version of Cactus by the Pixies and I've Been Waiting for You by Neil Young. Despite not being Bowie originals, these songs fit in wonderfully with the actual original material on here, like the incredible album opener, the track Sunday. Beautiful song. Heathen is an extremely cohesive and thoughtful record. Its bold blends of art rock and electronica, combined with the very melancholy lyrical content, results in a record that is both stark and beautiful. Underrated album alert. Underrated album alert. Over the years, Earthling has received quite a bit of flack, and it's not hard to see why. Part of what made Bowie such a remarkable artist and figure in rock music was just how many sounds and styles of rock music that he had helped to, pioneer. He was there at peak glam rock in the early 70s, and in the late 70s he was pushing boundaries in the fields of art rock and ambient electronic. Hell, he even had quite a bit of influence on, 80s pop rock. There are just so many movements in rock history where Bowie just kind of seemed to be there first, and Earthling represents a rare moment in his career where Bowie was late to the party. In this case, the party was the sound of UK drum and bass and jungle. While it may not be the most novel record in the drum and bass genre, Earthling's influences extend far beyond the guidelines of that genre and help it to kind of stand on its own as a very sharp and engaging experimental rock experience. On this album, Bowie melded the breakbeat loops and frantic tempos of drum and bass with the industrial, Trent Reznor-inspired aesthetic that he had toyed around with on his last album, Outside, which results in a number of excellent songs. Little Wonder combines skittering jungle percussion with driving rock choruses to spectacular effect, and the searing electronica on Dead Man Walking is thrilling. And of course, there's the song I'm Afraid of Americans, which went on to become one of the most notable sleeper hits of Bowie's career, and actually got approval from Trent Reznor in the form of a very popular Nine Inch Nails remix. Earthling is without a doubt an album of style over substance, but it's kind of hard to deny just how stylish it is. The production is fantastic and filled with tons of interesting sounds and quirks. Bowie is on point vocally, and the melodies are razor sharp. Diamond Dogs, the last chapter of Bowie's glam rock period, and his second real bona fide concept album. Originally intended to be a musical adaptation of George Orwell's 1984, Diamond Dogs is a staggeringly theatrical album. It makes use of an instrumental palette that is lavish even by Bowie standards, and some really seamless, impressive song transitions to enhance the kind of theater atmosphere. From a storyline standpoint, Diamond Dogs depicts a post-apocalyptic, dystopian world ravaged by war and oppression and the rebellious characters that inhabit it. While it is an intriguing premise, the story itself isn't really as clear-cut as something like Ziggy Stardust, which is often considered to be Bowie's finest concept album. But it's hardly some impenetrable, obnoxiously artsy concept record either, mostly because the music on Diamond Dogs is really great. Diamond Dogs is just bursting with musical variety. It's got moments of near operatic scale, like the reprise of Sweet Thing, the descending piano octaves, the dramatic drum fills, the vocal performance that is aimed for the rafters. It's also delightfully dramatic. Yet there are plenty of great, straightforward rock and roll numbers too, like the title track, or the song actually titled 1984. Of course, there's the hit single Rebel Rebel, which still remains one of Bowie's most iconic tracks ever. Not much to say about this one. It is incredibly catchy. It's got one of the most recognizable guitar riffs in rock history, and the lyric, "You've got your mother in a whirl. She's not sure if you're a boy or a girl," is perhaps the most Bowie lyric that Bowie ever Bowied. Diamond Dogs is a really great rock record that makes up for its somewhat convoluted concept with fantastic writing and super tight and impressive execution.
There's always a diamond friendly.
Another underrated album alert, Outside, or One Outside, I don't know, is easily one of Bowie's most overlooked works, in my opinion. This is a really interesting record for a number of reasons. After a prolonged period of writing more commercial-leaning music, Outside was Bowie's return to the warm embrace of the avant-garde. It is Bowie's longest studio album, standing tall at 74 minutes, and it is yet another concept album, complete with odd little spoken word interludes that further the plot. Outside's fictional narrative follows the detective Nathan Adler as he attempts to solve a series of interconnected murders that all have strange artistic undertones to them. And it was also his first album since the late 70s, when he was making the Berlin trilogy, to feature the input of experimental music pioneer Brian Eno. In the late 70s, when Bowie and Eno were working on the Berlin trilogy together, they created some of the best experimental rock of all time, and more than 15 years after the creation of those albums, their chemistry remains strong on Outside. And in a major contrast to just about every other record in Bowie's discography, Outside placed a large emphasis on improvisation. Apparently, Bowie would go into the studio without having many of the songs written. This decision led to many of the more rock-oriented tracks being built around like a single groove that would just build and continue to gain elements and kind of shift and change throughout the song. It was pretty cool. Much like Earthling, the album that followed it, Outside is heavily influenced by the sounds of 80s and 90s industrial music. These songs, The Heart's Filthy Lesson, A Small Plot of Land, and the single Hello Space Boy are paranoid experimental rock bangers with pounding industrial kick drums and blaring guitars. The album does balance out its rougher moments with some more calm and kind of jazzy tracks, like a reworked version of Strangers When We Meet from Buddha of Suburbia acts as a very nice closer to this album. It sounds beautiful here. All in all, Outside is easily the most ambitious and strangest album of Bowie's 90s output, and in my opinion, of that era, I think it's the best one too.